Okay, welcome back to Native American History course. This is going to be a lecture on the War of 1812. And it's pretty interesting because you can go on like Amazon.com or PBS and stuff. There's a lot of documentaries and stuff about the War of 1812. But I also think that like growing up, at least for myself, I went to public schools in the US. We didn't learn that much about the War of 1812, other than famous things like um, the Star Spangled Banner song, like being composed from the poem that's written about one of the battles. And so that kind of stuff is interesting. But so there's a lot of context, and I feel like in general, of course, my U.S. students don't really know that much about Native American history. But in this case, with even American history, there might be some significant gaps to fill in here. So I'm going to play um, this. Here we go, and so we maybe need some initial context. Of course, in earlier lectures, we talked about the American Revolution in the 1770s through 80s, and really the 1790 Citizenship Act, right? Which definitely introduces, it's not just the Citizenship Act, definitely the Constitution already brings race into the factor, right? Even the Declaration of Independence, which is before the Constitution, of course, right? Um, uh, Casts Indians as savages, right? Uh, and we get this kind of three-fifths clause in the U.S. Constitution in relationship to African slaves or black slaves, if they're African American slaves at that point, because many people have been here for a long time by then. And in proximity to that, there's already this notion that showed up in law from the early 1700s on of whiteness, right? So it's important to think of whiteness and the privileges that come with whiteness here as a legal construction that gets codified at different times in law, although it's a really squirrely kind of concept because a lot of times what the law does is it tries to say who is not white, right? And who gets let in as a citizen and who doesn't get in as a citizen throughout the next couple of centuries. Uh, and that's probably a broader discussion just on race in general than for the Native American course here. When we think about the War of 1812, a couple of international contexts that always we want to keep in mind, even though it's a Native American history class. First of all, the Brits had been beaten, of course, during the American Revolution, but there are 80,000 colonists in what's called Upper Canada. Now, Upper Canada is going to be closer to the Great Lakes, and Lower Canada is going to be further north. So it kind of might be a little bit counterintuitive. Um, uh, Versus at this point, 7.5 million Americans who are colonizers, right? So a lot more Americans than there are Brits. Uh, Many people in Congress see Canada as the next logical step in controlling the entire continent. And when I teach classes like Race and Power in US History, for example, this is one of the questions I think that all US citizens, I mean, other students of American history too, if you're not a US citizen, but I think that we need to think about like to what extent are the intentions from the revolution on to create some sort of an empire, right? That's an ongoing question. Definitely race is instantiated in the founding documents, and that creates a problem, and there's a civil war in relation to that later on. But there are definitely folks by 1812 in Congress who really think that there's some sort of providence, right? That it's God's plan for the United States to occupy the entire North American continent. Now, I mean, you might hear echoes of that in current day rhetoric from the current president, Donald Trump 2.0, right, in his second term, right, who's claiming that Canada will become part of the United States. So it's interesting that this is that kind of aspiration among Americans was there pretty early on. Um, England at the time is at war with France, and so there aren't a lot of troops up in Canada. There's only about 9,000 British troops up in Canada, which means that the Americans are kind of like, we could take this, right? Like if we wanted to, and then we would just control the whole continent. England is at war with France, who is being led at this point by Napoleon, who's got his own sort of uh, fantasies of empire throughout Europe. Uh, in Canada, British General Isaac Brock, who's a kind of young guy, who's born in Guernsey, a Channel Island off of England. He becomes a major player, at least in the early part of the war. And he gains some respect from Native Americans because he's very bold in some of the moves that he makes. At the same time, as the war is kind of coming to a head, like the decision to go to war is coming to a head, England dominates the seas and it's been blocking European ports, but also regularly seizing American ships and forcing sailors into the British Navy as deserters, right? So they're saying basically they're not recognizing that the United States is a thing, and these Americans are really just defected or deserter um, British citizens who need to be conscripted, is the term, into the British Navy. And it's really because the British Navy really needs people, manpower, to go and fight against Napoleon. Okay. So, more context here. The Americans issue an ultimatum in 1812 to Britain, overtaking sailors, but Britain doesn't take it seriously. Brock up in Canada views the American government as just a bunch of unruly men. Like the Brits just like yeah, they lost the revolution, but I don't think at this point a lot of British people have really given up on the idea that really this is just an unruly colony by people who don't know how to govern themselves. There are fewer than 9,000 British troops in Canada, as I said, to control 600,000 acres. Only 1,000 troops even occupy the border forts. Brock sees alliance with natives as a possibility against Native Americans. The Mohawk war chief John Norton, who was educated in Scotland, has a journal that's worth reading. It's a good source for showing that the native view of English is that the English are fair weather friends, right? The English back out when it's convenient to them and leave natives high and dry, um, as um, as happened in the American Revolution. So, Shawnee leader named Tecumseh comes along, and we see this as a kind of pattern. If you remember my earlier lectures, where we talked about Pontiac and Neolin, Tecumseh is going to show up, and he's got a prophet um, uh, counterpart as well named Tenskwatawa. And um, so Tecumseh sees British as potentially helpful to stopping Western expansion because he's got a big beef against the Americans because his own father has been killed when he's a young child by Americans who keep invading in, of course, into Ohio Territory, which was supposed to be Indian territory according to the Royal Proclamation in 1763, and then the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, of course, in 1768, and that, of course, incensed the colonists. And then the American Revolution comes along, and now after the Revolution, people are just moving further and further west, encroaching on Native folks. So, from the Native perspective, from Tecumseh's perspective, anyone, Americans. Um, come on in sudden surprise attacks, destroying villages and slaying warriors throughout the region, right? So there's no telling when they come. But they keep coming and keep coming. They also come hungry. The Americans come hungry, and then when they're fed, after they're fed, they enact violence on the native peoples. They poison sources of fish. They get natives drunk and then give them trinkets in exchange for land and mountains. They make alliance. So Tecumseh makes alliance with Brock, perceiving him to be straightforward in his dealings with the natives. And part of this is that Brock promises that if they win, then there will be an Indian nation, right? That they will solidify the boundaries of an Indian nation. This is a promise that goes on not just with the Brits, but with Americans over and over and over again, where promises are made that there's going to be some sort of like native territory whose boundaries are respected, and it never happens. It never happens with reservations. It certainly never happens with a nation, even though we have reservations for a while. The threats to the border and sovereignty are always a question when it comes to native peoples. And that's going to take us into some of the decisions in our next lecture with 1823's Johnson v. McIntosh and the court cases that lead up to Indian removal, right? So we have to talk about the United States and its kind of foundations, especially in terms of its legal system and the Supreme Court and Congress when we're talking about Native American history, because all Native Americans have to, once the United States becomes dominant, they have to keep on um, uh, acting in some sort of proximity or asymmetrical power to the United States. And it's hard for us as historians, I think, because, from early on, and Ned Blackhawk's book talks about this too, the inland sea, as Ned Blackhawk refers to it, from Ohio Valley over to the Mississippi Valley, that's really what everybody is really after. It's what the American colonists are after. The native folks, of course, want to keep it, and the Brits want to keep some sort of access to trade for there. So it's partly about trade and commerce for the people like the Brits. It's about land grabbing for the colonists, and it's about land holding for native folks who obviously benefit from trade as long as their boundaries are respected, right? So Brock makes a treaty with Tecumseh guaranteeing a separate native country in North America. Back to the American perspective, then, we've got Thomas Jefferson and his party, which we'll call the Democratic Republicans. The terms that we use, Democrat and Republican, in contemporary times don't correspond well back to this part of the country. And then there's also like Whigs. There are different Federalist parties, like so, perspectives to be thinking about. And so, Thomas Jefferson is a Democratic Republican, but he's not the Republican Party that we know today doesn't emerge until President Lincoln is the first Republican. Of course, that party's like values are really different today than they were back then. And the Democratic Party that we know of today begins with this guy, Andrew Jackson, who will come up today. So when we're talking about Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party, it's a party that no longer exists in American politics. So Jefferson, who's pretty old at this point in time, sees Canada as an easy grab. And we know that Thomas Jefferson, during his presidency in the early 1800s, he was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase, right? Because he bought that, giving money to Napoleon, right? Because Napoleon wanted money to fund his wars back over in Europe. And so we see this aspiration to empire and this aspiration to control the continent a bit with Thomas Jefferson for sure. In Congress, there's a group of people called the War Hawks. They're members of that party, the Democratic Republicans, such as Henry Clay and others. They defeat a brief resurgence of the Federalist Party with Richard Johnson in Kentucky, declaring the conquest of Canada as a matter of destiny. So this is that rationale, this rhetoric that these Americans are having, that it is God's plan, it is destiny, it is providence. That term manifest destiny doesn't show up until the 1840s. It comes from a famous essay, but we can already see that in the early 1800s, there are many colonizer Americans that are having that kind of attitude. Andrew Jackson is another one. So he supports invading Canada and sees it as an opportunity to establish free trade and to settle the Indian question once and for all by conquest of all the British dominions on the continent. Um, so America declares war on England, and James Madison is the president at the time of the war. Uh, General William Hull leads the first American invasion on foreign soil. So, just in terms of American history, more broadly speaking, this is the first time. So, it's pretty early on into the Republic. If you think about like the Constitution being figured out in the late 1780s, and then taking a while to get ratified completely, and then we get legal systems and economic stuff going underway, the Treaty of Greenville and things like that, Louisiana Purchase. There are big things happening, but there's this actual invasion on foreign soil. Now we have to put that in maybe quotes, because of course, you know, they, from the Native American perspective, are all foreigners to begin with. So, you know, it's an invasion on foreign soil as in terms of the Brits, but the um, it shows that kind of thinking already shows that there's not so much of an accounting for Native people going on in the Americans' thought. Brock up in Canada with the Brits wants to go on the offensive. Hull has this rhetoric, General Hull, the American governor of Michigan Territory at the time. He has this rhetoric and he calls England savage for aligning with savages. And he declares that the war on England and any native allies will be a war of extermination. We know that in the 21st century as genocide, like they will leave no prisoners, they will kill everybody, scorched earth policies, and all of that. So he's got this very strong type of attitude, and we'll see that he doesn't necessarily live up to it. But it echoes Andrew Jackson's and other sentiment, like we need to get rid of England once and for all and get rid of the natives and just get the land. So again, this is part of a kind of just war theory. If you go back to earlier thinking from the Papal Bulls earlier on, what happens is that like the native peoples are instigated through encroachment, through outright violence, into reacting violently, and then they are blamed for being so-called savages, right? And because they're savages, it justifies, according to the Euro-Christian colonizers, that they need to go in and clean house and bring civilization and all of the sorts of things, the Christianity, all of that kind of stuff. So initially in the War of 1812, we see British victories, which is kind of surprising because there's a lot more American troops. But that's because of this guy, Isaac Brock, General Brock, who has teamed up with Tecumseh. And so we see the British surprise attack on Fort Mackinac, which is right up here, if you can see, like in the northern point of Michigan here. And you can see that that's like the only trade route between the two lakes here. So it's a massively strategic point. Um, so they send a fast-growing unit with 500 natives 40 miles across the Great Lakes. Victory is almost immediate because the American soldiers don't even know yet the war has been declared. So they don't know because like, there's no mail, there's no certainly no email, right? There's no way to get the messages across. So um, uh, the Brits have found out that the Americans have declared war, and then they go ahead and take um, Fort Mackinac. Brock then pushes off west and to the west end of Lake Erie, Hull is paralyzed by indecision. So Hull, who had this rhetoric, this is going to be a war of extermination, Hull gets paralyzed by indecision and he retreats back to Detroit from Sandwich, claiming that he expects a large body of savages is going to kill him. So he's got his family with him. He starts worrying that they're going to mutilate him or mutilate his children. And so, for all of that talk about extermination, he's developed this gigantic fear of Native people, and his fear turns into cowardice. Um, so Tecumseh, who's outnumbered 4-1, attacks repeatedly, and using scalping as a fear tactic on the Americans. The natives don't necessarily invent scalping. The scalping practices, especially the getting bounties for it, comes from English colonization of Ireland earlier on. But as a phenomenon, scalping, there's a lot to be said about it. It can show up on almost all of the continents, not Antarctica in the world, right? So it's not a phenomenon that is only particular to Native Americans, but the bounty system that the Euro-Christians implement creates these different waves of what scalping is. And so Tecumseh basically is just like um, uh, embracing this kind of fearful identity that someone like Hull has in order to scare the Americans. Um, uh, he then defeats the Americans in two separate attacks. Cole loses his also then this is just like um like mistake after mistake that Hull makes. Hull eventually loses his secret letters of military plans and correspondence with Washington, D.C. in a trunk on a boat that's captured by the Brits on Lake Erie. So all of the American secret war plans are now public knowledge to the Brits. So things are not going too well for the Americans under Hull. Brock, who is the guy who's the British general who's promised Indian territory to Tecumseh, seizes on Americans' fear of the natives, the savages as well. So we want to think back when we think about the legacies of this kind of savagery kind of stuff, just note that it becomes used as propaganda throughout history in order to do things like like develop fear of the native peoples for the War of 1812 by the Brits, right? The Americans are more afraid of the natives than they are of the British. Uh, he sends a bluffing letter directly to Hull saying that while he himself doesn't approve of a war of extermination, he will have no control over the massive amount of Indians who may kill all of the Americans. He's just like, he's just bluffing, but he's meeting Hull with Hull's own rhetoric of this idea of a war of extermination. When when Brock attacks, Hull then refuses to fire back. Fearful of losing his daughters and grandchildren at the fort, he surrenders. His officers circulate letters for his removal due to poor command. 2,000 Americans. Now, like one of the things that gets Hull his position is that he's an older veteran of the Revolutionary War. So there's a lot of younger American military people who want nothing to do with him, and he's a drunk, and there's all sorts of other things that going on there too as well. But anyway, so 2,000 Americans give up to a force half its size. Hull is then taken captive and later sent to the Americans, who at first convict him of cowardice and sentence him to death, but then he gets a presidential commutation of sentence from Madison. So it's like the founding fathers kind of looking out for each other there. Brock acted counter to orders for his British superior, but because he was so successful, he gets away with it. Um, so he claims all of Michigan to be now under British control and names Tecumseh Wellington of the Indians. The U.S. then retaliates. They regroup near Niagara Falls. Brock anticipates it. The U.S. crosses Niagara River and captures a cannon above Queenston Heights. But then Brock leads a counterattack and he's killed by an American sniper. This is devastating for Native Americans because Brock, not only was he like a go-getter in terms of his military planning, he was the only British leader who had promised the natives this their own territory, their own country. So then the Mohawks, who are of course part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, join the fight, and remaining Americans hear war cries and refuse to cross the river out of fear of Indians. They leave Americans who had crossed stranded, and then they surrender. Um, the Americans have respect for Brock after they find out that he's died, and they honor his death. They also, this is like a something else that like Brock is a person who, like, when you look at his journals and stuff, he like asks to have like Homer's Odyssey, like, or like translations of the Odyssey, and like any kind of Roman history about war and great heroes. He emulates this kind of classic nature of a military hero, like in Greek and Roman times. And he brings that kind of romance into his own thinking as well. And the Americans kind of have it too, in the way that they honor him as the great fallen enemy. And they do that with Native people too. Like, oh, they're so savage, but they were pure and noble in their savageness, or something like that. So Tecumseh then loses a trusted ally and the one who's promised the homeland to the natives. Tecumseh's rhetoric is important here, not only because it echoes a phenomenon that had already begun back with Pontiac, which is a rhetoric of different native cultures or nations aligning together, right? Like what we might call a pan-Indian movement. And so these are some of the things that he sees. His name means falling star. There are astrological signs that seem to portend some of his victories and his relationship to this stuff, and especially Tenskwatawa, the prophet, is another part of that as well. Um, they set up a town called Prophetstown, which is would be, close to like Western Ohio, northwestern Ohio today. Maybe over in Illinois. I don't know exactly the boundary for the state there. Prophetstown was an Indian village of in this new way of thinking, right? That what was important was for all native peoples to band together against the colonizers. And we see that all the way up into the American Indian movement in current times, right? But especially in the late 20th century. So when we're thinking about like Indian activism or Native American activism, uh, there's a centuries long history of this kind of thing, and probably, although it's harder to tell, um, we probably it is probably happening even before Europeans arrive here. I mean, we can kind of see it with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, right? Who band together, and then different groups can split off, like the Mohawks, for example, or different than Onondaga or Oneida folks, right? Seneca folks. So in Tecumseh's rhetoric, the Indians have been played against each other by settlers. Sorry for the typo there. His own father was killed by white settlers, as I said, and he calls the native people, to return to traditional ways. He calls on native people to resist alcohol. He establishes a model commune called Prophetstown in 1808. He denies the legality of all treaties, saying that the settlers just steal land. They never hold up their treaty agreements anyway, so why even go into treaty making with them? General William Henry Harrison, who becomes later president around 1840, sets himself against Tecumseh. They meet, um, uh, and Harrison argues that the land is the U.S. by the Treaty of Paris, when they won the Revolutionary War. Keep that in mind for my next lecture on Doctrine of Discovery and the 1823 Johnson v. McIntosh. From the Americans' perspective, when they won the war with the British, they also won the rights of discovery to the territories. Doesn't mean that the territories have been discovered yet, right? Because just like Lewis and Clark's expedition for the Louisiana Purchase, that is a voyage of discovery where Thomas Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark out on these expeditions to give American flags to Native people and to tell them that they have a new leader or a new grandfather back in Washington. And if they hang the American flag above their villages, then the U.S. Army won't harm them, right? That's a voyage of discovery. Claiming land where they were looking for a Northwest Passage to the Pacific, right? So Harrison then attacks while Tecumseh is brokering peace with Indians in the South. And so Tecumseh is building up a big alliance up in the north, and he goes down south and he's trying to get Creek and Osage and other folks involved. And when Harrison knows that he's in the South, he goes in and destroys Prophetstown. This sets Tecumseh on the war path. If it weren't already like, if he wasn't already on a war path, he's definitely on a war path after Prophetstown is destroyed. James Madison, the president, then responds. In the summer of 1813, Madison pours efforts into the American control of the Great Lakes under the thinking that whoever controls the waters therefore controls all of the trade, including the trade with the natives. So he can defeat Indians economically, if not militarily. The Americans then defeat British ships in 1813. British ground troops under General Proctor withdraw, much to the disgust of Tecumseh, who feels like once again, now that he doesn't have somebody like Brock on his side, he's dealing with British cowardice. Tecumseh rallies for an inland battle and then gets the Brits to join. During the battle, Proctor and his men flee the field, and then Tecumseh is killed. So he's partly killed because the Brits have like they've left him high and dry. So Proctor later court-martialed for cowardice for leaving the field. So the Americans then respond to Tecumseh's death by glorifying him. Though Canada doesn't celebrate him for his role in helping preserve Canada or save Canada and the First Nations. So it's an interesting kind of phenomenon, the way that people read Tecumseh, the way that Euro Christians, whether Canadians or U.S. citizens, read Tecumseh's role here. Harrison attributes his victory to providence, okay, the hand of God, and later becomes president again in 1840. As the war continues on, it becomes more and more controversial among U.S. citizens. So some are like the war hawks. They want America to become an empire. Some don't want that. So the position of the Democratic Republicans, remember this was Thomas Jefferson's party, is challenged from the start in Congress. Senate passes the vote to go to war because actually presidents are supposed to, according to the Constitution, get the vote of Congress in order to go to war, although that's being contested, like in 21st century times with our presidents who more and more seem to be um, uh, authorizing military decisions that are warlike without consulting Congress first, but that's a contemporary issue. House of Representatives is particularly divided on the issue. By 1813, there's a large anti-war campaign against conquest. New England depends on trade with Canada and England, but Madison makes it illegal. Public protests over fear of higher taxes and compulsory. Um, uh, uh, the public fears higher taxes and compulsory military service. The Constitution says that that Congress is supposed to be able to deal economically and with trade with native nations, right? So Madison supports the war to defend American sovereignty against the British. So that's an interesting thing because he's a Federalist as the president, but he still supports the war. Sedition is in the air already by 1814. New England threatens to withdraw from the Union. So why? Why would this happen? Well, because in the North in New England, those states or colonies, I guess they're states now, is the correct term. those states in the United States benefit highly from trade with Britain, but the southern states don't benefit so much. And so um, when war is declared, it just destroys the economy in New England. So then they talk about seceding from the United States to reestablish that trade and be economically viable. American troops finally win a battle at Chippewa under Winfield Scott, but he's later wounded and defeated by the Brits at Lundy Lane. But Winfield Scott is like the American hero of the War of 1812, and he remains, one of the principal players in U.S. military politics all the way up until the Civil War. Meanwhile, around this time, Napoleon is defeated over in Europe, and the Americans then retreat to the U.S. and British forces are moved from Europe to Canada because now the U.S., who had a lot more soldiers, now no longer has the advantage because the Brits can take all their active military forces who no longer need to fight against Napoleon and move them over to Canada. So in August of 1814, George Prevost goes on the offensive on the ground. British ships arrive in Chesapeake Bay and deploy 5,000 soldiers to attack Washington. George Armstrong, Secretary of War, thinks that the Brits are going to attack Baltimore instead. Dolly Madison, who's to the president, um, fears an attack on Washington. And lo and behold, the Brits do take Washington, attacking government buildings, including the White House. The Madisons flee to the house of the French ambassador, and Armstrong resigns as the Secretary of War. The Brits then go on to Baltimore, where the American army is strong, and on September 13th, 1814, do battle. After 3 days, the Brits then retreat. National anthem is then based on that battle in 1814, the Rocket's Red Glare business. So the Americans defeat the British Navy then in Plattsburgh Bay, which is kind of a miraculous defeat because the British Navy is really well trained and really well equipped. So it's a strategic win for the Americans. The Brits lose then heavily, although peace had already been established back in England around Christmas time of 1814. The word doesn't spread to the northern continent for several weeks. And so during that time, the Brits lose massively in January 1815 to Jackson at New Orleans, losing 2,036 soldiers, while the Americans only lose seven. This automatically makes Andrew Jackson into this like mythological hero, and he's going to capitalize that when he becomes president, and he's going to use that hero status to enact Indian removal. Peace had been made in Ghent in December, but the word had not gotten across the Atlantic. That is going to be the end of this lecture on the War of 1812. It's going to shape not only the tensions that we can see between um, Native peoples and the emergent U.S. government, but also American history in ways that will have its fallout in the Civil War later on. Okay. Have a great day whenever, wherever you are.